The wedding dress felt like a funeral shroud against Aria Calloway's skin as she stood in the torchlit chamber beneath the streets of Manhattan, waiting to marry a monster she'd never met. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She'd clasped them together so tightly her knuckles had gone white, but still they trembled, betraying every ounce of terror coursing through her veins. Around her, the assembled vampire court watched with eyes that gleamed like polished rubies in the flickering light, their pale faces beautiful and terrible all at once. They wore silks and velvets in deep crimsons and midnight blacks, their white hair styled in elaborate fashions that spoke of centuries past. They looked like living marble statues, perfect and cold and utterly inhuman. Aria had been taught about vampires her entire life, everyone had. 20 years ago, when the veil between worlds had shattered during what the history books now called the Convergence, the vampires had emerged from their hidden realm and revealed themselves to humanity. The world had nearly ended in those first chaotic months. Wars had broken out, cities had burned, millions had died on both sides before the treaties were finally signed, establishing an uneasy peace between the two species. The peace held, but it was fragile, maintained by strict laws and careful diplomacy, and occasionally, by sacrifices like the one Aria was about to make. Her father's gambling debts had destroyed their family. He'd borrowed from the wrong people, made deals with creatures who didn't forgive or forget. When he'd finally drunk himself to death 6 months ago, those debts had fallen to Aria and her younger brother. The vampires could have killed them both. Instead, they'd offered an alternative. Aria would marry into the vampire nobility, and in exchange her brother would be free, the debts erased. She'd agreed without hesitation. James was only 16. He deserved a life, even if hers was about to end. The great doors at the far end of the chamber swung open and the assembled vampires fell silent. Aria's breath caught in her throat. Quinlan Ashenfell entered like darkness given form. He was taller than any man she'd ever seen, easily 6.5 feet, his presence so commanding that the enormous underground cathedral suddenly felt too small to contain him. His hair was white as fresh snow, falling past his shoulders in a straight, heavy curtain that caught the torchlight. His skin had the same pale luminescence as all vampires, but on him it seemed fitting, almost regal. He wore black from head to toe, simple but impeccably tailored, and moved with a predator's liquid grace. But it was his face that made Aria's knees threaten to buckle. He was beautiful the way a blade was beautiful. Sharp, cold, dangerous. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, lips that would have been sensual if they weren't pressed into such a hard line. And his eyes crimson like fresh blood, ancient beyond measure, fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel like she was being examined and found wanting. This was Quinlan Ashenfell, the Vampire King. Ruler of the Eastern Territories, commander of armies, older than most of the buildings in the city above. They said he'd killed thousands during the wars. They said he was merciless, brutal, that he'd torn out the throat of his own brother for challenging his rule, and she was about to become his wife. He crossed the chamber in long strides, his footfalls completely silent despite his size. When he reached her, he stopped, towering over her 5'4" frame. Up close, she could see the otherworldly quality of his features, the slight point to his ears, the way his eyes seemed to glow with their own inner light. "You're trembling," he said. His voice was deep, resonant, with an accent she couldn't quite place. Old European, perhaps, from before the borders had been drawn as they were now. Aria tried to speak, but her throat had closed up. She managed a jerky nod. Something flickered across his face, too quick for her to read. Then he turned to the vampire officiating the ceremony, an ancient-looking creature with silver jewelry woven through his white hair. "Begin," Quinlan commanded. The ceremony was mercifully brief. Aria barely heard the words being spoken, some mixture of English and a language she didn't recognize, flowing and harsh all at once. She was asked to repeat vows she couldn't focus on, her voice barely a whisper. When Quinlan spoke his vows, his eyes never left her face, and she couldn't tell if he was memorizing her features or deciding how quickly he could drain her dry. Then it was over. The officiant declared them bound, and the assembled vampires made a sound like wind through dead trees, their version of applause. "You may seal the bond," the officiant said. Quinlan reached out and Aria flinched before she could stop herself. His hand froze in midair, and for a moment, something that might have been pain crossed his features. Then his expression hardened into stone, and he grasped her chin with careful, cold fingers, tilting her face up. "This will hurt," he said quietly, for her ears alone. But only for a moment. Before she could process his words, he'd bent his head, his lips brushing the curve where her neck met her shoulder. She felt his breath, surprisingly warm, and then a sharp burning pain as his fangs pierced her skin. Aria gasped, her hands flying up to clutch at his arms. The pain was intense but brief, just as he'd promised, replaced almost immediately by a strange, dizzying warmth that spread through her body. She could feel him drinking, could feel something deeper shifting inside her, like invisible threads being woven between them. The bond. She'd read about this. Vampire marriages weren't just legal contracts, they were mystical, binding the partners together in ways humans couldn't fully understand. She would be able to sense him now, always know where he was, feel echoes of his emotions. And he would be able to sense her, and so much more. He pulled back, his tongue flicking across the puncture wounds to seal them. Blood stained his lips, and his eyes had taken on an even brighter glow. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, his hands now gripping her arms, his gaze boring into hers with an expression she couldn't decipher. "My king?" the officiant prompted. Quinlan blinked, then released her and stepped back. "The ceremony is complete, leave us." The vampires began to file out, moving with their characteristic eerie grace. Aria stood frozen, her hand pressed to her neck, feeling the rapidly healing wounds. Vampire saliva had coagulants and healing properties. Within an hour there would be no mark at all. Soon they were alone in the vast chamber, just Aria and the creature who was now legally, mystically her husband. "Come," Quinlan said, not looking at her. "I'll show you to your quarters." He didn't wait for a response, simply turned and strode toward a different set of doors. Aria hurried to follow, her heels clicking on the stone floor, the sound absurdly loud in the silence. He moved so quickly she had to nearly run to keep up, her wedding dress tangling around her legs. They passed through a maze of corridors, all carved from stone and lit by electric lights designed to look like torches. The vampire court existed beneath the city, a network of chambers and halls that stretched for miles. Above, humans went about their daily lives, most of them never knowing what lay beneath their feet. Finally, Quinlan stopped before an ornate door and pushed it open. "Your rooms." Aria stepped inside and couldn't quite suppress her gasp. She'd expected a cell or at best a spare chamber. Instead, she found herself in a lavish suite that would have put most luxury hotels to shame. A four-poster bed dominated one wall, draped in deep burgundy silk. Thick carpets covered the floor, and actual paintings, originals, by the look of them, hung on the walls. There was a sitting area with plush furniture, a massive wardrobe, even a door that she assumed led to a bathroom. "The wardrobe has been stocked with clothing in your size," Quinlan said from the doorway. "If you need anything else, there's a bell pull by the bed. Someone will attend you." Aria turned to face him, trying to organize the chaos of her thoughts into words. "Thank you." His expression didn't change. "Don't thank me. This arrangement serves my purposes as much as yours." "What purposes?" The question escaped before she could stop it. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "The vampire houses have been pressuring me to take a bride for decades. They see my unmarried status as a weakness, an opening for challenges. A human wife satisfies the requirement while preventing any vampire family from gaining advantage through a marriage alliance. So I'm a political tool." "Yes." He didn't try to soften it, as I'm sure you expected. She had, but hearing it stated so bluntly still stung. "And what are my duties then? Besides existing?" Something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "You will attend certain functions at my side. You will comport yourself appropriately. And you will remain in these quarters unless summoned or given explicit permission to roam the court." "I'm a prisoner then." "You're a queen," he corrected, his voice hardening. "And you're alive. Many humans in your position would consider that more than sufficient." The words hit like a slap. Aria felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She'd known what she was agreeing to. There was no point in self-pity now. "Is there anything else, my king?" She was proud that her voice came out steady. Quinlan studied her for a long moment, and again she couldn't read his expression. "You're afraid of me," he finally said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Aria admitted. "What was the point in lying?" "Good," he said. "Fear will keep you alive in this place." Then he turned and left, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Aria stood alone in her gilded cage and finally let the tears fall. The first 2 weeks passed in a strange, isolated blur. Aria saw almost no one except for the servants who brought her meals and attended to her needs. They were human, she was surprised to discover, people who'd chosen to work in the vampire court for reasons she couldn't fathom. They were polite but distant, answering her questions with brief responses that discouraged further conversation. She spent her days reading books from the small library in her sitting room, trying on the clothes in her wardrobe, all beautiful, all in shades of deep jewel tones that she suspected had been chosen to complement her dark hair and fair skin, and attempting not to think about the fact that she might spend the rest of her life in these rooms. The bond made it impossible to forget about Quinlan, though. She could feel him constantly, a dark presence at the edge of her awareness. Sometimes he felt calm, focused. Other times, a cold rage pulsed through the connection, and she wondered what had angered him, what he might be doing to whoever had earned his wrath. Once, late at night, she'd felt something that might have been loneliness, but it had disappeared so quickly, she thought she might have imagined it. He never came to her rooms. She was pathetically grateful for that and disappointed in equal measure, though she couldn't have said why. On the 15th day, a servant informed her that the king required her presence at a formal dinner that evening. Aria spent hours getting ready, trying on half the dresses in her wardrobe before settling on a gown of deep emerald silk that brought out the green in her hazel eyes. She'd always been pretty in an ordinary way. Nothing spectacular, medium height, slender build, features that were pleasant but unremarkable. Next to the otherworldly beauty of the vampires, she knew she'd look plain, but she could at least try not to embarrass Quinlan. Why she cared about that, she didn't let herself examine too closely. The same servant returned to escort her through the winding corridors. Aria tried to memorize the route, counting turns and noting landmarks, but everything looked the same. Stone walls, electric torches, the occasional ornate door. Finally, they reached a set of double doors guarded by 2 vampire warriors. The guards' eyes tracked her with predatory interest that made her skin crawl, but they opened the doors without comment. The dining hall was enormous, with a table long enough to seat 50 people. About 20 vampires were already present, standing in small groups, talking in low voices. They all turned when she entered, and the weight of their collective attention made Aria want to flee back to her rooms. Then Quinlan was there, appearing at her side as if he'd materialized from shadows. "Stay close to me," he said quietly, "and let me do the talking." She nodded, grateful for his presence despite everything. He placed a hand on the small of her back, and she felt a strange comfort in the touch. Even though his fingers were cold through the thin silk of her dress, he guided her into the room, and immediately several vampires approached. They were all beautiful in that terrible vampire way, their white hair elaborately styled, their clothing rich and elegant. But there was something calculating in their eyes that made Aria's instincts scream danger. "Your Majesty," one of them said, a woman whose blood-red dress matched her eyes. "How delightful that you've finally brought your bride to meet us." "We were beginning to think she was a myth." "Lady Seraphine," Quinlan acknowledged, his tone perfectly neutral. "May I present my wife, Aria?" "Aria, Lady Seraphine leads House Night Hollow." "Charmed," Seraphine said, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Tell me, dear, how are you finding life at court? It must be quite an adjustment for a human." "It's been very interesting," Aria managed, trying to keep her voice steady. "Everyone has been very welcoming. How diplomatic of you." Seraphine's gaze swept over her, assessing. "And so young. You can't be more than what? 22, 23, 24, Aria said. "Still practically a child." Seraphine's tone was lightly mocking. "I do hope you're not too overwhelmed by all this. Court politics can be so terribly complex, especially for someone of your limited experience." Aria felt Quinlan tense beside her, his hand pressing more firmly against her back. "My wife's experience is sufficient for her role," he said, his voice dropping into a register that made even Aria's bones ache with the implied threat. "As I'm sure you'll remember, Seraphine." The vampire woman's smile tightened. "Of course, Your Majesty, I meant no offense." Other vampires approached throughout the evening, all offering congratulations that felt like veiled insults, asking questions that seemed designed to make Aria stumble. She did her best, keeping her answers brief and polite, but she could feel the hostility rolling off them. They saw her as an interloper, a weakness in their king, a human where a vampire should be. Quinlan never left her side. His hand remained at her back the entire time, a steady anchor, and whenever the questions became too pointed or the tone too mocking, he would interject with a quiet comment that had the other vampires backing down immediately. Finally, they were seated for dinner. Aria found herself at Quinlan's right hand at the head of the table, the position of honor. Servants brought out course after course of beautifully prepared food. The vampires didn't eat, of course, but they kept her company with goblets of what she tried very hard not to think about. "Your Majesty seems quite protective of his human bride," a male vampire said from further down the table. "Lord something." Aria had already forgotten his name. One might almost think there was genuine affection there. Several vampires laughed, the sound like ice cracking. "One might think," another vampire added, "that our king has grown soft in his old age, concerned with a human's comfort rather than the strength of his rule." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Quinlan set down his goblet with exaggerated care, and Aria felt a wave of cold fury pulse through their bond that made her breath catch. "Lord Valdrin," Quinlan said softly, addressing the vampire who had spoken, "would you care to elaborate on your concerns about my rule?" Valdrin paled, his confidence evaporating. "I know," Your Majesty, I only meant, you meant to imply that my marriage makes me weak. Quinlan's voice was still soft, still perfectly controlled, but Aria could see the other vampires shrinking back in their seats. That my choice of bride reflects poorly on my ability to rule. No, I stand up. Valdrin stood, his movements jerky with fear. Come here. The vampire approached on shaking legs, stopping a few feet from Quinlan's chair. Quinlan stood, unfolding to his full, imposing height, and reached out to grip Valdrin's throat. I have ruled for 300 years, Quinlan said, his voice cutting through the absolute silence in the room. I have crushed rebellions, ended bloodlines, and held these territories through wars that would have destroyed lesser kings. And you think a human bride makes me weak? He lifted Valdrin off the floor one-handed, the vampire clawing uselessly at his wrist. Aria watched in horrified fascination, her heart pounding. She knew she should be terrified, should be repulsed. This was the monster she'd married, showing his true nature, but all she could feel through the bond was Quinlan's protective rage, hot and fierce. He wasn't angry about the insult to himself. He was angry about the insult to her. My wife, Quinlan continued, is under my protection. Any slight against her is a slight against me. Any threat to her is a threat to the crown. Do I make myself clear? Valdrin made a choking sound that might have been agreement. Quinlan held him for a moment longer, then released him. The vampire collapsed to the floor, gasping. All of you will remember this, Quinlan said, his gaze sweeping the table. Aria Ashenfell is your queen. You will treat her with the respect that position demands, or you will answer to me. And I promise you, my mercy has limits. He sat back down and calmly picked up his goblet as if nothing had happened. Continue your meal, my dear, he said to Aria. I apologize for the interruption. Aria stared at him, her food forgotten. She should say something, do something, but she couldn't organize her thoughts. No one had ever defended her like that. No one had ever made something else literally bow before her, acknowledge her value. She'd never felt more confused in her life. The rest of the dinner passed without incident. The vampires were subdued, shooting nervous glances at Quinlan and curious ones at Aria. When it was finally over, Quinlan escorted her back to her rooms, his hand once again at her back. At her door, she turned to face him. Thank you, she said, for what you did in there. His expression was unreadable. I told you. Insults to you are insults to me. It was more than that. She didn't know where she was finding the courage to push, but she couldn't let this go. I felt it through the bond. You were angry for me, not just because of some slight to your authority. Quinlan's jaw tightened. You're reading too much into vampire politics, am I? For a long moment they stood there, his crimson eyes locked on hers. Then he said, get some rest, you did well tonight. He turned to leave, but Aria reached out without thinking, her fingers catching his sleeve. He froze. Why do you keep avoiding me? She asked quietly. You're my husband, but I've barely seen you since the wedding. Would you prefer I visit more often? His tone was carefully neutral. Stake a greater claim on my marital rights? Aria flushed, but didn't back down. I'd prefer you treat me like a person instead of a political inconvenience you've hidden away. Something flashed in his eyes, surprise maybe, or respect. You're not what I expected, he said finally. What did you expect? Someone more broken, defeated. He tilted his head, studying her. You agreed to this marriage to save your brother. I thought you'd be a martyr, resigned to suffering. But you're angry. Would you prefer defeated? She challenged. No, he said, and there was something almost like warmth in his voice. No, I wouldn't. He pulled away gently, freeing his sleeve from her grip. Good night, Aria. Good night, she whispered, watching him disappear down the corridor. That night, alone in her enormous bed, she lay awake, feeling the echo of his presence through the bond and trying to understand what was happening between them. The pattern changed after that. Quinlan began having dinner with her several times a week, served in her rooms rather than the formal dining hall. They were strange, quiet affairs at first. He would ask about her day, and she would report the nothing that had happened. She would ask about his, and he would give vague answers about court business and territorial management. But gradually they began to actually talk. Aria learned that Quinlan had been born in what was now Romania in the early 18th century, turned into a vampire during a war whose details had been lost to time. He'd been a soldier, a leader even then, and he'd carried those instincts into his immortal life. He'd fought his way through the vampire hierarchy, brutal and determined, until he'd claimed the eastern territories during the chaos before the convergence. I've made enemies, he said one evening, swirling blood in his goblet. Many enemies. Some of the houses would like nothing more than to see me fall. Like Lord Valdrin, Aria asked. Valdrin is a minor irritant. There are others, older and more cunning, who pose real threats. He paused. That's part of why I married you. A human bride gives them less to work with than a vampire alliance would have, but it also makes you look weak to some of them, Aria pointed out. Let them think I'm weak, his eyes gleamed. It makes them careless. She was starting to understand that Quinlan was always thinking several moves ahead, that everything he did served multiple purposes. It should have felt manipulative, but instead, she found it fascinating. He asked about her life too, and she told him about growing up in a small apartment in Brooklyn, about her father's slow descent into alcoholism after her mother's death, about taking care of James and working 3 jobs to keep them afloat, about how the debt collectors had come the day after her father's funeral, and how the vampire representative had made his offer with a knowing certainty that she would accept. Your brother is well, Quinlan said one night. I have people checking on him. He's enrolled in a good school, has a safe place to live. The trust I established will cover his expenses until he's 30. Aria felt tears prick her eyes. You did that? It was part of the agreement. No, the agreement was that the debt would be erased. You didn't have to provide for his future. Quinlan looked uncomfortable. It seemed practical. You'd worry otherwise, and that would be inconvenient. She didn't believe that was his only reason, but she didn't push. Thank you, she said softly. He inclined his head, then changed the subject with his characteristic abruptness. As the weeks turned into months, Aria began to venture out of her rooms more. Always with Quinlan or an escort, she explored the court, discovered a vast library that became her favorite refuge, and even attended a few more formal functions. The vampires were still cold to her, but they were polite now, wary of their king's protection. She also began to notice things about Quinlan that contradicted his fearsome reputation. The way he ensured she always had fresh flowers in her rooms, even though he never mentioned it. The way he adjusted his impossibly long stride when they walked together so she could keep up. The way his hand would find the small of her back in crowded rooms. A gesture that had become comforting rather than merely possessive. And the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, with something in his crimson eyes that she couldn't quite name but that made her heart race. She was falling in love with him. The realization came one evening as they sat in her sitting room, playing chess. He'd been teaching her, patient with her mistakes, and she'd just executed a strategy that forced him into checkmate. Well done, he'd said, and the genuine pleasure in his voice had made her chest tighten with emotion. She loved him. She loved this ancient, dangerous creature who'd defended her honor, who ensured her brother's safety, who was slowly revealing depths beneath his cold exterior that she suspected few people ever got to see. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. She didn't tell him. How could she? He'd married her for political convenience. He was kind to her, protective even, but that didn't mean he felt anything beyond duty toward his human bride. But the bond betrayed her. She could feel her emotions flowing through the connection, knew he must be able to sense the shift in her feelings. And sometimes when their eyes met, she thought she saw something flare in his gaze that might have been answering emotion, or it might have been wishful thinking. Winter came to New York, and with it, increased tension in the court. Aria didn't understand all the politics, but she could feel Quinlan's stress through the bond, a constant undercurrent of wariness and controlled aggression. He spent more time in meetings, less time with her, and when he did visit, he seemed distracted. What's happening? She asked one night when he'd been particularly distant. He hesitated, clearly debating how much to tell her. There are rumors of a challenge, he finally said. A coalition of houses that believe they could take the territory from me. That's ridiculous. You're the strongest vampire I've ever seen. Strength isn't everything in vampire politics. Numbers matter. Alliances matter. He rubbed his face tiredly, and for the first time she saw the weight of his centuries on him. They'll move soon. Probably at the winter solstice gathering. Public enough to force a response, traditional enough to have legitimacy. What will you do? Win. He said it with such flat certainty that she almost believed nothing could threaten him. But she could feel his concern through the bond, and it scared her more than she wanted to admit. The night of the winter solstice gathering arrived with a bitter cold that penetrated even the underground chambers. Aria dressed in a gown of midnight blue that made her look like she was wearing the night sky, her dark hair elaborately styled by the servants. She looked like a queen, she thought, studying herself in the mirror. She just hoped she could act like one. Quinlan came to escort her personally, and when he saw her he stopped in the doorway, his expression arrested. You look beautiful, he said, and there was something raw in his voice that made her blush. Thank you, she managed. You look very handsome as well. He always did, but tonight he wore formal attire that emphasized his powerful build and regal bearing. He looked every inch the king, dangerous and magnificent. He offered her his arm, and she took it, feeling the cool strength of him even through his sleeve. "Stay close to me tonight," he said as they walked, "and if anything happens, if things become violent, you run. Do you understand? You find the nearest exit and you run. I'm not leaving you." "Aria, I'm not," she said firmly. "I'm your wife. I belong at your side." He looked like he wanted to argue, but they'd reached the gathering hall. The doors opened, and they stepped into chaos barely contained by a veneer of civility. The hall was packed with vampires from all the major houses, hundreds of them, all dressed in their finery. The air crackled with tension, and Aria could feel the weight of hostile stares as Quinlan led her through the crowd to the dais where two thrones sat. She'd never sat on a throne before. It felt surreal and terrifying. The gathering proceeded through various formalities, reports from the houses, discussions of territorial matters, petitions brought before the king. Aria tried to follow it all, but vampire politics were Byzantine in their complexity. She focused instead on sitting still and looking composed, aware that every vampire in the room was watching her, judging her, looking for weakness. Then a vampire she didn't recognize stepped forward. He was ancient, she could tell, power radiating from him in waves. His white hair was shot through with silver, and his eyes were pale red, almost pink. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying through the hall, "I bring a petition from the southern houses." "Speak, Lord Dreven," Quinlan said. His tone was neutral, but Aria felt tension coil through him. "The southern houses believe that the eastern territories have grown weak under your rule," Dreven announced. "That your attention has been divided, your judgment compromised. We believe it is time for new leadership." A murmur ran through the hall. This was it then, the challenge. New leadership? Quinlan's voice was dangerously soft. "You presume to question my rule? We presume to invoke the old laws," Dreven said. "The laws that allow any vampire of sufficient standing to challenge for territory through trial by combat. The southern houses have chosen me as their champion." More murmurs, louder now. Aria's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Quinlan stood and the hall fell silent. "You invoke the old laws. Very well, I accept your challenge, Dreven. But know this: when I defeat you, the southern houses will bend the knee and accept my rule for the next century without question. Those are my terms, and when I defeat you," Dreven countered, "the eastern territories will be absorbed into the south, and your human bride will be released to return to her world. We have no interest in her." "Done," Quinlan said immediately. Then he turned to Aria, and she saw something in his eyes that made her chest ache. "Go to your rooms. Wait for me there." "Quinlan, please." The single word was almost pleading. "I need to know you're safe." She wanted to argue, but she could see how important this was to him. She nodded and stood, forcing herself to walk calmly from the hall even though every instinct screamed at her to stay. The servants escorted her back to her rooms, but she couldn't bear to sit still. She paced, feeling Quinlan's presence through the bond as he prepared for the fight. His emotions were tightly controlled, but she could sense the lethal focus settling over him, the cold determination. And underneath it, hidden so deep she almost missed it, was fear. Not for himself, for her. He was afraid of what would happen to her if he lost. The realization nearly drove her to her knees. He cared about her, not just as a political piece or a responsibility, but genuinely cared about her well-being, her future. He loved her, and she couldn't just sit here while he risked everything. Aria threw open her door and nearly ran into a servant. "I need to get back to the gathering hall," she said. "Now, my lady," the king said. "I don't care what the king said. Take me back, please." The servant, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, studied her for a moment, then nodded. "This way, quickly." They ran through the corridors, Aria's formal gown hampering her movements. She could feel Quinlan through the bond now, feel the surge of adrenaline and power as the fight began. She pushed herself faster. They burst into the gathering hall to find absolute chaos. The vampires had formed a wide circle, and in the center, Quinlan and Dreven were locked in combat that was almost too fast for human eyes to follow. It was brutal and beautiful all at once. They moved with supernatural speed and strength, trading blows that would have shattered stone. Blood spattered the floor, vampire blood, black in the dim light. Quinlan's face was set in hard lines of concentration, his movements economical and lethal. But Dreven was old, powerful, and he'd brought allies. As Aria watched in horror, 3 other vampires broke from the circle and rushed to join the fight. "No," she screamed. "That's against the rules." No one was listening. The hall had erupted into violence, vampire against vampire, old alliances and grudges playing out in a flurry of fangs and claws. And Quinlan was now fighting 4 opponents at once. Aria shoved through the crowd, not caring that these creatures could kill her without effort, focused only on reaching her husband. She could feel his surprise through the bond as he sensed her presence, feel his fear spike. "Aria, get out," he roared, even as he tore out one vampire's throat. But she'd seen something he hadn't. A fifth vampire, young and quick, circling behind him with a wooden stake raised high. She didn't think, she just moved, throwing herself forward even as the vampire lunged. She crashed into Quinlan's back just as the stake came down, and felt a white-hot explosion of pain in her shoulder as the wood pierced her flesh instead of his heart. She heard Quinlan's bellow of rage, felt his emotions through the bond go nuclear with fury and fear. Then the world went blurry and she was falling, strong arms catching her before she hit the ground. "Aria! Aria!" Quinlan's face swam above her, his eyes wild. "No, no, stay with me. Is it bad?" she managed to ask. The pain was excruciating, radiating out from her shoulder in waves. "You're bleeding," his voice cracked. "There's so much blood." She could feel it, warm and wet, soaking her beautiful gown. The stake must have hit an artery. That was bad. That was very bad. "The fight," she tried to say. The fight is over," a new voice said. Aria managed to focus enough to see Lord Dreven kneeling nearby, his hands raised in surrender. "Your Majesty, I yield. The challenge is withdrawn. Please, save your queen." Quinlan wasn't listening. He'd bitten into his own wrist and was pressing it to Aria's mouth. "Drink," he commanded. "Drink, damn you." She tasted blood, rich and strange and nothing like she'd expected. It burned going down, but the moment it hit her system, she felt something shift. The pain began to recede, and she could feel her body starting to knit itself back together with impossible speed. Vampire blood. He was healing her with his own blood. "More," he insisted, and she drank deeper, feeling strength flow back into her limbs. The stake was still in her shoulder, but the wound around it was closing, forcing the wood out. Finally, it clattered to the floor, and she gasped as the last of the pain faded. Quinlan pulled her against his chest, his arms like iron bands around her. She could feel him shaking. "Never," he said into her hair, his voice raw. "Never do that again, do you understand me?" "Never. You were going to die," she said, her own voice unsteady. "Then I would have died. But you." He pulled back to look at her, and she was shocked to see his eyes bright with what might have been tears. "You stupid, brave, impossible woman. You could have been killed. So could you. I'm a vampire. I'm meant for violence and death. He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "You're everything good in this world. Everything soft and warm and alive. I can't lose you. I won't." "Quinlan," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. His skin was cold as always, but his expression was anything but. "I love you." He froze. Around them, the hall had gone completely silent. Every vampire watching their king cradle his human bride as if she was infinitely precious. "Say that again," Quinlan said hoarsely. "I love you," Aria repeated. "I have for months. I was just afraid to tell you." "Afraid of me?" "Afraid you wouldn't feel the same way." He laughed, the sound broken and beautiful. "You fool, you beautiful, ridiculous fool." Then he was kissing her, his lips cold but his passion blazing hot, pouring 3 months of denied emotion into the contact. Aria kissed him back with everything she had, her fingers tangling in his white hair, not caring that they had an audience of hundreds. She'd almost died. He'd almost died. Nothing else mattered except this, except them. When they finally broke apart, Quinlan rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said roughly. "I have since the moment you flinched from my touch on our wedding night, and I realized you weren't just afraid, you were brave enough to marry me anyway. I've been falling deeper every day since. You've undone me completely, Aria Ashenfell." She felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were happy tears this time. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" The fearsome vampire king and his trembling human bride. "You haven't trembled in front of me in months," he pointed out. "You haven't given me reason to. You've been nothing but kind to me. I have 3 centuries of atrocities behind me, rivers of blood on my hands. Kindness is not a word often associated with my name. Maybe that's because no one ever gave you reason to be kind before." She cupped his face in both hands. "I see you, Quinlan. Not the monster everyone fears, but the man beneath. The one who makes sure I have flowers, who protects me and defends me and secretly provided for my brother. The one who's been so desperately lonely for so long that he'd forgotten what connection felt like." His eyes closed, and a single red tear tracked down his pale cheek. "How do you see so much the bond?" she said simply. "I feel everything you feel, and you're not nearly as cold as you pretend to be." He opened his eyes and looked at her with such naked adoration that it stole her breath. Then he stood, lifting her easily in his arms, and turned to address the assembled court. "Let it be known," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "that my queen has proven herself this night. She faced death to protect her king, and in doing so, has demonstrated the kind of courage and loyalty that many of you lack." His gaze swept the crowd, hard and unforgiving. "Any vampire who doubts my choice of bride from this point forward will answer to me personally. She is my heart, my wife, my queen, and I will burn this entire court to ash before I allow any harm to come to her. Am I understood?" A chorus of voices answered him. "Yes, your majesty." "Good." He looked down at Aria, his expression softening. "Now if you'll excuse me, I need to attend to my wife." He carried her from the hall, moving with such speed that the corridors blurred past. Within moments they were back in her rooms, their rooms, she supposed, since Quinlan showed no signs of leaving. He set her gently on the bed and began examining her shoulder, his touch feather light despite his obvious agitation. "The wound is fully healed," he said finally, relief evident in his voice. "My blood worked quickly." "Your blood is still in my system," Aria realized. "Will it change me? Turn me into a vampire?" "No. It takes more than that, a complete exchange, done intentionally. This will just give you increased healing and strength for a few days, perhaps a week." He paused. "Unless you want to be turned, I would do it if you asked. I would give you immortality, centuries by my side." The offer was tempting. To never grow old, to never be separated from him by death. But Aria shook her head. "Not yet," she said. "Ask me again in a few decades when I've had a chance to live a human life. Then I'll consider it." "A few decades," Quinlan repeated, and she could hear the pain in his voice. "Such a short time to me, but your entire life. Then we'll make every moment count." She pulled him down to sit beside her on the bed. "No more keeping me locked away in these rooms. No more treating me like a political tool. I want a real marriage, Quinlan. Messy and complicated and real." "I don't know how to do that," he admitted. "I haven't been human in 300 years. I've forgotten what normal relationships look like." "Then we'll figure it out together." She laced her fingers through his. "We have time." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with surprising tenderness. "I will spend every day of your human life trying to deserve you," he promised. "And when you're ready, if you're ready, I will give you forever." "That sounds perfect," Aria whispered. He kissed her again, slower this time, taking his time to explore and savor. When he pulled back, his eyes had darkened to a deep crimson. "Stay with me tonight," he said. "Not for politics or appearances, but because I can't bear to be apart from you." "I'm not going anywhere," she assured him. They lay down together, Aria tucked against Quinlan's chest, his arms wrapped protectively around her. She could feel his contentment through the bond, warm and peaceful in a way she'd never sensed from him before. "I never expected this," he murmured into the darkness. "When they brought you to me for the wedding, I thought you were just another piece on the board, a convenient solution to a political problem. And now you're the only thing that matters." He tightened his hold on her. "The court, the territories, the power, it all means nothing compared to you. You've become my everything, Aria. It's terrifying." "Good," she said, echoing his words from their wedding night. "Fear will keep you honest." She felt him smile against her hair. "When did you become so fierce?" "I married a vampire king." It rubbed off. They fell silent, comfortable in each other's presence. Aria felt herself drifting towards sleep, safe and warm despite being in the arms of a creature that could drain her dry without effort. But she knew with absolute certainty that Quinlan would never hurt her. He would tear apart anyone who tried. "Aria?" His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. Thank you for saving my life tonight, for seeing past the monster to the man, for loving me despite everything I am." She pressed a kiss to his chest, right over where his heart would beat if he were still human. "Thank you for letting me." In the weeks that followed, life in the vampire court transformed. Quinlan was still the fearsome king everyone had always known, still commanded absolute authority and respect. But with Aria, he was different. Softer, more open, quicker to smile. He moved into her rooms officially, though they quickly redecorated to make the space feel like theirs rather than just hers. He taught her about vampire history and politics, brought her to meetings so she could understand the intricacies of court life, and in private he was achingly tender, making up for 3 centuries of isolation with the devotion he showed his human bride. Aria bloomed under his attention. She found her place in the court, not as a decoration or a political pawn, but as a true queen. She mediated disputes, offered a human perspective on policies that affected both species, and slowly won over even the most skeptical vampires with her quiet strength and genuine compassion. The bond between them deepened, became something that felt as essential as breathing. They could sense each other's emotions constantly now, could sometimes even share thoughts if they concentrated. It should have felt invasive, but instead, it felt like coming home. Winter gave way to spring, and Aria stood in the underground gardens that some long ago vampire had cultivated, watching bioluminescent plants cast their soft glow. She heard Quinlan approach. She always knew when he was near now, and leaned back against his chest when he wrapped his arms around her waist. "I spoke to James today," she said. "Through video call. He's doing so well, he got accepted to Columbia. I know, I may have written a letter of recommendation. Quinlan sounded pleased with himself. You did? She turned in his arms to look up at him. As the vampire king? As your husband? I have some pull in this city, you know. She laughed and kissed him. Thank you. That means everything to him. To me. He's family, Quinlan said simply. Of course I would help him, family. The word made Aria's heart swell. She'd been so alone for so long, just her and James against the world. Now she had Quinlan, had a place in the vampire court, had a future she'd never dared to imagine. I was thinking, she said carefully, about what you offered. About being turned. Quinlan went very still. And not yet, she said quickly. I meant what I said about wanting to live a human life first. But maybe in 20 years, 30, when I've had time to experience everything I want to as a human, but before I'm too old to enjoy immortality. You would really want that? His voice was rough with emotion. An eternity with me? Quinlan, I want every moment with you I can have. Human lifespan, vampire lifespan, whatever comes after, I want all of it. He kissed her breathless, pouring centuries of loneliness and longing into the contact. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were bright. Then I will wait as long as you need, and when you're ready I will give you forever. We'll face eternity together. Together, Aria agreed. They stood in the soft glow of the garden, vampire king and human queen, two souls that should never have found each other, but had somehow managed to create something beautiful from an arrangement born of politics and desperation. Above them, the city of New York pulsed with life, humans and vampires coexisting in their fragile peace. Below, in chambers carved from ancient stone, a love story continued to unfold that would become legend in the years to come, because sometimes the most fearsome creatures could be tamed by the gentlest touch. Sometimes the bravest act was choosing to love, and sometimes trembling human brides could win the fierce devotion of vampire kings and change the course of both their worlds. Years passed in a strange, beautiful rhythm. Aria navigated her dual role as human woman and vampire queen with increasing confidence, using her unique position to strengthen the bonds between the two species. She established programs that allowed humans to work safely in vampire territories, created cultural exchanges that helped both sides understand each other better, and became a voice of reason in a court that had known only power struggles for centuries. Quinlan was her constant support, her fierce protector and devoted husband. He sat through human movies she wanted to watch, learned to appreciate coffee even though he couldn't taste it properly, and made sure she saw sunlight regularly by arranging trips to their country estate where she could walk in daylight while he slept. He gave her everything she could possibly want and asked for nothing in return except her continued presence in his life. On their 5th anniversary, he gave her a choice. Your brother is graduating from university this spring, he said. I thought you might want to attend the ceremony. Aria's eyes widened. I would love that, but she gestured around them at the underground court. Can I leave? Is that allowed? You're the queen, you can do as you please. He smiled slightly. Though I would prefer to accompany you. I've never seen a human graduation ceremony. So they went, Quinlan wrapped in heavy clothing and staying in the shadows, but present nonetheless. Aria sat in the audience beaming with pride as James walked across the stage, and when he found them afterward he hugged her fiercely. Thank you, he said, including Quinlan in his grateful look. For everything, for the school, the support, the recommendations. For keeping my sister safe and happy. She keeps herself safe, Quinlan said dryly. Usually by throwing herself in front of stakes meant for me. That was one time, Aria protested. Once was enough to take a decade off my immortal life. They spent the day with James, catching up on his life, his plans, his girlfriend who Aria couldn't wait to meet. And when they finally returned to the court that evening, Aria felt more complete than she ever had. Her two worlds, her two families were no longer separate. They were merging, building bridges. More years passed. Aria celebrated birthdays that Quinlan marked with elaborate gifts and quiet devotion. She watched her brother get married, become a father, build a successful career. She aged gracefully into her 30s, then her 40s, still beautiful but with laugh lines forming at the corners of her eyes and silver threading through her dark hair. Quinlan never looked different, never aged a day. But his eyes had changed, she noticed. The coldness that had been there when they first met had been replaced by warmth when he looked at her, by contentment when they were together. He smiled more, laughed occasionally, let himself be vulnerable in ways that shocked the court but that Aria treasured. On the morning of her 45th birthday, Aria woke to find Quinlan watching her sleep, something he did sometimes when the weight of his immortality pressed too heavily. Tell me, she said softly. You have a gray hair, he said, reaching out to touch the silver strand. Right here at your temple. It's beautiful. I'm getting old, you're getting distinguished. But there was sadness in his voice, the awareness that time was moving forward, taking her further from youth with each passing day. Quinlan, she said, taking his hand, I'm ready. He went very still. Ready for what? To be turned, to become what you are. She smiled at his shocked expression. I've lived my human life. I've seen James grow up and start his own family. I've made peace with my past and built something meaningful in the present. But I'm not ready to leave you. I'll never be ready for that. Ah, Aria, he breathed. Are you certain? Once it's done, there's no going back. I've never been more certain of anything. She cupped his face in her hands. Give me forever, Quinlan. Let me spend eternity at your side. He kissed her then, deep and desperate, before pulling back to rest his forehead against hers. Tonight, he said, I'll make the arrangements. It has to be done properly, with witnesses from the court. And afterward you'll need time to adjust, to learn control. I know, I've been researching. She'd spent months reading everything she could find about the turning process, making sure she understood exactly what she was agreeing to. You'll lose the sunlight, he said, and she could hear the guilt in his voice. The ability to age, to have children, to I'll gain you, she interrupted. Forever. That's worth more than anything I'll lose. That night, the court assembled in the grand chamber where they'd been married 13 years earlier. Aria wore a gown of deep crimson, the color of blood, of rebirth. Quinlan stood before her in formal black, looking every inch the ancient king he was. You understand what you're asking for, he said formally for the benefit of the witnesses. You choose this transformation of your own free will. I do, Aria said clearly. Then I will grant it. He stepped close, his hands framing her face. I love you, he said quietly, just for her. In every lifetime, in every world, I will always love you. And I love you, she whispered back, now and forever. He bent his head to her throat, and she felt his fangs pierce her skin. Different from the bite at their wedding, deeper, taking more. She felt her blood flowing out, felt her life draining away, and for a moment she was afraid. But Quinlan's presence wrapped around her through the bond, steady and sure, and she relaxed into it. When she'd lost enough blood that her vision was starting to darken, he pulled back and bit his own wrist, reopening a vein. Drink, he commanded, pressing it to her lips. She drank, taking long pulls of his blood. It tasted different than she remembered, richer, more potent. She could feel it changing her, rewriting her at a cellular level. Her heart began to slow, each beat coming further apart, until finally it stopped altogether. She died in Quinlan's arms, surrounded by vampires, and felt no fear at all. The transformation took 3 days. Aria slipped in and out of consciousness, her body rebuilding itself, becoming something new. She was aware of Quinlan's constant presence, of his hands holding hers, of his voice murmuring reassurances when the pain became too much. Finally, on the 3rd night, she opened her eyes. The world had changed. Colors were more vivid, sounds sharper, scents overwhelming in their complexity. She could hear conversations happening rooms away, could smell the individual vampires standing guard outside her door, could see every thread in the silk canopy above her bed, and she was hungry. Oh God, she was so hungry. Easy, Quinlan said, sitting beside her. I know, the hunger is worst at the beginning. Aria looked at him and nearly wept. He'd always been beautiful, but now she could see the true depths of it, the supernatural perfection that mortals could only glimpse. His eyes glowed like garnets, and she could see the slow movement of blood through his veins beneath his pale skin. She wanted to bite him. The urge was overwhelming. Not me, he said gently. Not yet. You need to learn control first. He held up a goblet filled with blood, fresh and still warm. Drink. It will help. She took it with shaking hands and drank, and the taste exploded across her tongue like the richest wine she'd ever had. The hunger eased, and with it some of the overwhelming sensory input. She could think again. How do you feel? Quinlan asked. Aria took stock of herself. Stronger, faster. Her body felt powerful in a way it never had before, and alive despite technically being dead. I feel incredible, she said, then paused. My voice sounds different, slightly more resonant. He was watching her carefully, gauging her reaction. Do you regret it? Not even a little bit. She reached for him, marveling at the speed of her own movement. How long until I have control? Weeks, maybe months. You'll need to learn to manage the hunger, the enhanced senses, the strength. But I'll teach you. He pulled her close. We have all the time in the world now. The adjustment was harder than Aria had expected. She broke things constantly as she learned to manage her new strength. The hunger was a constant presence that took all her willpower to control, and the heightened senses were overwhelming, requiring her to learn filtering techniques that older vampires took for granted. But Quinlan was patient, guiding her through each challenge, and slowly she adapted. After a month, she could move through the court without breaking furniture. After 3 months, she could attend formal functions without fixating on the heartbeats of human servants. After 6 months, she felt like she'd been a vampire her entire life. Her new status changed things in the court. Before, she'd been an outsider, a human anomaly. Now she was truly one of them, powerful in her own right. The other vampires treated her with newfound respect, and Aria used her position to push for even more integration between species. She also used her new abilities to protect what she and Quinlan had built. When threats arose, she stood at his side, fierce and deadly. The trembling human bride had become a warrior queen, and the vampires who'd once looked down on her now feared and respected her in equal measure. But the best part, Aria discovered, was the simple joy of knowing they had forever. No more watching the clock, counting down the years until age separated them. No more midnight fears about what would happen when she died. They had centuries ahead of them, millennia perhaps, and every moment was a gift. On their 20th anniversary, 7 years after her turning, Quinlan took her to the surface at midnight to show her the city from the top of their private building. New York sprawled below them, a glittering tapestry of lights and life. "Do you remember what you said to me on our wedding night?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I said a lot of things," Aria pointed out. "I was terrified. You were trembling," he agreed, shaking like a leaf. "I thought you might faint when I had to bite you for the bond. To be fair, you did look particularly intimidating that night." "I was trying to." He rested his chin on top of her head. "I thought if I could intimidate you, keep you at a distance, it would be easier. That I wouldn't get attached. How'd that work out for you?" "Terribly. You threw yourself in front of a stake for me less than 6 months later, and I realized I'd been completely lost from the moment I saw you in that wedding dress." Aria turned in his arms to face him. In the moonlight, his white hair seemed to glow, and his red eyes were soft with emotion. "I used to be afraid of you," she said. "Did you know that?" "Of course I knew. I could smell your fear. I'm not afraid anymore." "I know. Now you're terrifying in your own right." He smiled. "The other houses call you the Iron Queen. Did you know that? They say you're as fierce as I am, but more cunning." "Good," she grinned, showing fangs. "Let them fear us both." He laughed and spun her around in a move that would have been impossible with human reflexes, dipping her low. "I love you, Aria Ashenfell, my queen, my partner, my eternal companion." "And I love you," she said. "My king, my protector, my heart." He kissed her there on the rooftop, surrounded by the night that was now as much her domain as his. And Aria thought about the terrified young woman who'd stood in that underground chamber 13 years ago, agreeing to marry a monster to save her brother. That woman couldn't have imagined this, couldn't have conceived of the love she'd find, the strength she'd discover, the future she'd build. She'd thought she was sacrificing herself, but instead, she'd found everything she'd never known she wanted. The years continued to unfold, each one bringing new challenges and triumphs. Aria watched her brother age and eventually pass away peacefully at 93, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. It hurt, losing him, but she'd had more time with him than she'd ever dared to hope for, and she carried his memory with pride. She and Quinlan ruled the Eastern Territories with wisdom and strength, modernizing vampire society while honoring its ancient traditions. They survived assassination attempts, political coups, and the occasional territorial dispute, and through it all, their bond only deepened, the love between them growing richer with each passing decade. Sometimes, late at night when the court was quiet, Quinlan would pull Aria close and marvel at how his life had changed. "I was so alone before you," he'd say. "So cold, I'd forgotten what it felt like to care about something beyond power and survival. And now?" Aria would ask, though she knew the answer. "Now I remember what it feels like to be alive." He'd kiss her temple, her cheek, her lips. "You gave that back to me. You gave me everything." On the 50th anniversary of their wedding, the vampire court threw a celebration that lasted 3 nights. Vampires came from all over the world to pay their respects to the king and queen whose love story had become legend. They told tales of the human bride who'd faced death for her king, of the fearsome vampire who'd been tamed by love, of the partnership that had transformed not just the Eastern Territories but vampire-human relations across the globe. Standing in the center of the celebration, Aria looked around at the court she'd come to call home, at the vampires who'd become her friends and allies, at the world they'd built together. Then she looked at Quinlan, her husband, her partner, her love, and saw her entire future reflected in his crimson eyes. Forever stretched ahead of them, vast and full of possibility. They would face it together, fierce and devoted, the vampire king and his queen, bound by love that had conquered fear and transformed them both. And every day for the rest of eternity, Aria knew she would wake up grateful for the choice she'd made all those years ago. To step into the darkness, to marry a monster, to take a chance on a love that should have been impossible. Because sometimes, the most terrifying decisions led to the most beautiful destinations. Sometimes, trembling in fear was just the first step toward finding courage. And sometimes, everyone's fearsome vampire king just needed the right person to win his fierce devotion and show him that even immortal hearts could learn to love. Their story would be told for generations, a reminder that love could bloom in the darkest places, that strength came in many forms, and that happy endings were possible even in a world divided between daylight and darkness, mortality and eternity, fear and devotion. Aria Ashenfell, once a trembling human bride, now the Iron Queen of the Eastern Territories, had won her happily ever after. And it was more than worth the price of admission, the end.